Today's episode is brought to you by Greenman Open. In a world of market swings and geopolitical shifts, it's natural to look for investments built on something more foundational. That's the thinking behind Greenman Open, a European long-term investment fund focused on one of the most resilient sectors there is, grocery-anchored real estate. The idea is simple. However the economy fluctuates, people still need to buy food. Open invests in the essential grocery retail properties that communities rely on every day. The fund earns income from investors from the rent those tenants pay, aiming to provide a source of stable, long-term income. It's a regulated fund designed to make this type of real estate investment accessible to everyone. You can become part of Greenman Open from just €1,500, either through your financial advisor or directly with the Greenman Open app. To learn more, visit greenmanopen.com. A quick but important note, all investments carry risk. The value of your investment may go down as well as up, and you may get back less than you invest. Past performance is not a reliable guide to future performance. Hello and welcome to Path to Power. I'm Matt Cooper and today we're joined by Brenda Power and Larry Donnelly. Thank you both very much for being with us. So we have lots going on in the world, which is of enormous impact on Ireland, what's going on in the United States. Micheál Martin's visit to China. I will talk to you as well about Elon Musk and X and Grok AI. And we'll also talk perhaps a little bit about road debts and political responsibility. And I know you were writing during the week as well, Brenda, about an interview that Lou McDonald did in the Sunday Times. And I also want to talk about Jim O'Callaghan and something that he sneakily tried to put in after Christmas in relation to the Garda Act and journalists having to reveal information to the Gardaí. So we've lots to actually get through. But I want to start with Mercosur because we're recording this Friday morning. There's a meeting today in Europe to ratify the agreement between the European Union and the Mercosur nations, which are Brazil, Argentina, Colombia.
Paraguay and Uruguay.
Paraguay, yeah. And maybe it's Colombia in there, maybe not. It's not actually, yes. Although there's a number of countries in Latin America which are sort of auxiliary members to Mercosur. And this is a deal that has been 25 years in construction and nearly got done last year. And then there was a kickback by a number of European countries, including Ireland and the likes of Italy and France. And then it went back for further renegotiation and also for changes, compensation to farmers in Europe who would be impacted by Mercosur. So we've had quite the week in relation to it because it became quite clear, I think, that Micheál Martin, when he was in China, was trying to lay the ground for a switching of the Irish government's position on Mercosur. And he got the kickback. And he got a bit of a kickback within Fine Gael from the Agriculture Minister Martin Hayden, who said he was against it. And then the rural independents kicked back as well, those who were in government. And Michael Healy-Rae, Junior Minister, issued a statement which was one of those Michael Healy-Rae statements which looked like he was outside of government entirely, telling the government what to do. But I just wonder about the politics of all of this. And again, is this a sign of a certain degree of Micheál Martin's weakness in this position at the moment, or a sense of where he just has to be pragmatic and practical? Because it was in the programme for government that they would oppose Mercosur unless there were major changes. And it doesn't seem that we had the major changes that the opposition was demanding. Or could it be that the bigger picture demanded that we actually need to do Mercosur, particularly given what's happening with the United States, that we need for our pharmaceuticals and for our microchips and all the things that are far more valuable to us than agricultural exports, to be doing deals like this, to see the bigger picture rather than, and pandering is perhaps the wrong word, which would inflame any farmers listening, but that we needed to support this deal rather than been against it. Brenda.
And this is the single biggest deal ever negotiated by the EU. As you say, Matt, and it has been 25 years in the making and obviously become much more urgent in the last year since Trump's tariffs began to kick in. I think the perception is, yes, that Micheál Martin, still weakened by the Jim Gavin affair, had little option but to back down on this. In a way, you could say that the government has now got the best of both worlds because the blocking minority was actually falling apart and was not going to be able to resist this. So I guess
at the European Union
this
level,
is at the European
because
Union
the
level.
Italians had changed their position.
Exactly. Even though the French are still opposed to it, but there simply wasn't a strong enough minority to block it. So it's going to go ahead. And I think there was a sort of a get-out clause. If you look at the wording in the programme for government, it was the current deal. So I think Micheál Martin was priming himself to say, we've had significant concessions on antibiotics. There's been sweeteners in terms of the cap. There have been concessions on pesticides, a carbon tax on fertilisers has been suspended. So there are a lot of concessions in this for Irish farmers. And the advantages, as you say, in terms of the exports, machinery and pharmaceuticals, of course, pharmaceuticals being particularly important, was going to carry the day. But I think that the resistance by the rural independents, and particularly Michael Healy-Rae, as you say, phrasing it as, I hope the government don't do this now, of which he is, of course, a junior minister. I think that was just too much domestically for him to overcome. The question is, the suggestion has been made now that we have burnt up some capital.
Well, that's it, because is it that we're being
EU.
too clever by half in the way that we deal with a lot of things in the European Union? We're too clever by half when it comes to things like defence and our involvement in it. We look for things like the nitrates directive last year, which we managed to get a carve-out again for farmers in it. And, we burnt a lot of capital back around the time of the crash. Yeah. And then we managed to rebuild our relationships. And we've asked an awful lot of our European Union fellow members in relation to things like Brexit. And yet when it suits us, we sort of back, oh, well, no, we can't be doing that. We can't be getting involved in defence, or we can't be sending the Mercosur deal. Or is it that with a nod and a wink, we'll be just saying, look, we had to do this because of domestic politics. We're really in favour of Mercosur. We'll implement it and we'll be great president of the European Union in the second half of the year.
They can't really afford to isolate us because of the presidency coming up later in the year. And also, if there's any sign of any punishment to Ireland in terms of this, the Brexiteers will be all over it saying, aha, you see, look what happens when you stand up to this so-called democratic union. You get wrapped on the knuckles.
You stole my thunder in a way there, Matt, because I'm not usually a conspiracy theory guy, but let me put something forward to you. I take the point that Micheál Martin's position is weakened, but I don't think he was unaware of the depth of opposition within government to Mercosur. And at the same time, he knows about Ireland's position within the European Union. So my own sense is that he put that out there, basically saying, in vague terms perhaps, but I'm pretty much in favor of this, and I'd like to see us get it done. However, the reaction then was immediate and was strong, up to and including the agriculture minister, and the resistance was furious. And I think in terms of playing this with Europe, he will then be able to say to Ursula von der Leyen, look, I did everything I possibly could to get us to sign on to this, but the domestic political resistance was such that he could probably even make the case that perhaps the government might have been on shaky ground, and look, we don't need this ahead of our presidency of the European Union.
A couple of other things that struck me, and there's a degree of supposition in relation to this, but I wonder that when he was in China, and given that he was involved in big trade talks with the world's most powerful economic nation, with the exception of the United States, that he got a little bit maybe carried away with the whole thing that, we're part of the world trade and we have to be seen to be doing deals, so we can't be seen to be undermining Mercosur on that he got a little bit swept away by the position he was in.
There might be an element to that, and I do think that certainly when you look at the pomp and circumstance of the visit, in many respects, you couldn't help but be bolstered as a small country in a massive country with the treatment that they received.
It would have done his ego a bit of good.
Absolutely. And let's look at the converse reality. There is opportunity for sure for Ireland, and we must take advantage of it, especially because of the situation in the United States. But at the same time, the fact is that China is not doing all of this out of the goodness of its own heart.
Well, exactly. They were giving Ireland, little old Ireland, such a big treatment. I know we have a major trading relationship. It's our fifth biggest trading partner globally, which is quite extraordinary when you think of it. Now, a lot of that is to do with the value of microchips and pharmaceuticals, but we do export an enormous amount of dairy to there as well. We want to get our beef back in. And the irony is, while we're complaining, quite rightly, our farmers about the quality of the beef coming from Brazil. The Chinese won't take our beef because they're not sure it's healthy enough for them.
Was that since a BSE scare in
Yeah.
2024?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that the Taoiseach said that the Chinese Premier said they want to import more Irish food. I was thinking maybe we should try them with spice bags. But also that they want to invest in offshore wind energy.
See, that's a really interesting one. And I wonder, that was brought up by Micheál Martin a couple of times in two interviews that I saw that he brought it up with the Chinese media. And this is something China has done around the world. And we actually have also our subscription edition with Brenda. We discussed a little bit into this as well. But we have, all around the world, China has managed to establish enormous influence by investing in hard assets, roads in Africa in particular, Latin America and the rest of it. So we might decide, and given that we have failed in the last 20 years or so to actually put in our offshore wind, having done so over 20 years ago, then we fell behind. Do we really want to hand it over to the Chinese to have that power over our electricity generation? But it's not even that. How would the rest of the European Union actually look at us if we're actually acting as almost like a proxy for China or a broker for China within the European Union, given the suspicion a lot of countries in Europe have about China and wanting to de-risk from China? And indeed, what would the Americans actually think of us if they see us, or we've been too clever by half again, in that we are so dependent on the United States, but actually want simultaneously to develop a major, bigger relationship with a country that the United States distrusts?
This is the tightrope that I think Micheál Martin and successive Irish governments are going to have to walk. The reality is China is massive. China is the future in many respects. So having a good relationship with them, and indeed, I think we're only one of two European Union countries that runs a trade surplus with China. So obviously it's been beneficial. At the same time, we do need to recognize that China is playing the long game here.
And when playing us, maybe.
Yeah.
Perhaps, yeah. And if you look at their spheres of influence, you mentioned buying up properties, et cetera, around the world, infrastructure, investments, and all of that, but also in higher education, seeking to have its influence right there.
So the Confucius Institutes in Irish universities and having a certain degree over control about the awarding of degrees as well.
Yeah, all of that I think is deeply worrying, and indeed that came up on Micheál Martin's visit. I think he defended the university system in Ireland from some of the charges that have been lobbed against it. But still, I think it is concerning on that front. And I think when it comes to our dealings with China, we need to approach things very warily and with ruthless self-interest in mind. And I don't just mean ruthless self-interest in the short term. I mean ruthless self-interest in the longer term.
Yeah, but hold on, Larry, let's call a spade in relation to this. Just like our relationship with the United States is entirely imbalanced in that we are very much a minnow who have very little power. It's exactly the same with China. We talk about having a nuanced relationship. China will squeeze us if it thinks it's in China's best interests.
Yeah.
And we're powerless to resist.
And Matt, that's why I refer to the tightrope that we need to walk. And the fact is, despite the difficulties that we're having now in the U.S. relationship, Ireland has benefited enormously from that relationship. And still, I think there's a possibility to benefit from a positive relationship with China. At the same time, however, we need to be wary. And that is not an easy task, but we have to do it.
See, they've... analysis by certain Chinese academics made no secret of the fact that they intend to use Ireland's soft power, or what they call our pragmatic diplomatic position and our economic needs as a sort of conduit to the EU to
they're using
to
us.
neutralise. Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
But as Larry says,
and we love being used in Ireland, don't we?
If we can extract any benefit from that, well, isn't that just the nature of real politics? And
Matt, I take all the points and questions that you're raising, and they're entirely valid. But at the same time, I'd ask, what's the alternative? Where do we go if we decide this is all this is too sketchy, we're going to avoid this and take a big step back? Is there a massive opportunity cost for this country in doing so?
Yeah, but see, it's also our relationships within the European Union. There's a lot of other countries in Europe are deeply suspicious of Chinese technology. Even the Americans, one of the main reasons the Americans are worried about China has been the theft of intellectual property in China, which is then used for the construction of new goods that the Chinese have become dominant in. The European car industry is exceptionally worried about subsidized electric vehicles coming in from China. And that's why we have the 43% tariff on dairy products imposed by the Chinese, was partly a retaliation about the new tariffs that have been introduced on Chinese cars by the Europeans. So also there were issues in relation to the purchase of property by the Chinese in Ireland. Also, our passport scheme, not passports, but it was a scheme for investment in relation to residency. Now, we did a lot on this with Dan O'Brien in the subscription edition last week, and Dan is fascinating and something of a China expert in relation to this. But I do think we have to be very, very careful, not just directly in our relationships with China. And, it's a totalitarian regime. There's lots of human rights abuses. And we, again, just seem to overlook those because there's commerce involved. But it will affect our relationships with the EU, and it will affect our relationships with America. And let's talk about our relationships with America, because I think it's been quite clear as well, wasn't it, Larry, that our government was unwilling to call out the kidnapping of President Maduro from Venezuela for what it was. And no matter how bad an individual he was and how badly he has run his country, and that he had actually stolen an election in 2024, because they're afraid to offend Donald Trump and his regime, they didn't actually call it out for the breach of international law and outrageous behaviour that it is.
Yeah, and there's no denying that that's what it was. Objectively speaking, a total breach of international law, which of course the United States has no regard for, and which effectively does not matter in the United States and does not bind the United States, because no one is going to enforce international law against the United States in any meaningful way. We talk about tightropes, and Micheál Martin and others who I've heard the question put to are trying to walk that tightrope. And again, it comes down to this point that we have established, as you said, this sort of minnow-type relationship with the United States. And now, which existed through Democratic and Republican administrations, but now we have somebody who has, prepared to wreck the transatlantic relationship, who has mentioned Ireland pejoratively in many contexts, and many of his top surrogates have their eye on Ireland for various reasons. As such, and because the costs of any damage to the Irish-U.S. relationship on any number of fronts would have a drastic consequence for this economy and in turn for this country, Micheál Martin is walking a tightrope. And again, I fully take on board those who are very critical, including the opposition voices. They are objectively and morally correct when they say that the Taoiseach should say that what the United States did was a breach of international law. But at the same time, he's in a very difficult position.
I mean, this is the reality. I know that in China, he did say, on the one hand, Maduro was a terrible, terrible character, and we never supported his regime. On the other hand, we have to support international law, and he commended the Chinese on their own commitment to the UN Charter and the international law, the rule of law.
And please don't invade Taiwan.
Yeah. No, but I mean, the reality is, this is even bigger than Trump, and it's bigger than Greenland, and it's bigger than Venezuela. What we are looking at is basically a huge regression in American relations with the rest of the world. He's said he's renamed the Monroe Plan from the 1820s, I think, the Donroe Plan, and that was basically, this is our hemisphere, that's your hemisphere. Stay out of American affairs, and Greenland is part of that, and so is obviously Latin America. And he has basically said, he was asked, I think, yesterday, what the limits on his ambitions are, and he said, it is limited by my own morality. In other words, I was wondering.
I actually wonder when I saw that, was that a typo? Did he mean he's limited by his own mortality? But no, it was his own morality. But he has no morality.
He has no morality. And he was asked about international law. He said, depends on your definition of international law. And then he said he needs Greenland as a psychological acquisition for
his ego.
Yeah. But I mean, the reality is, I think it was Steve Miller who said, look, the rule of law has always been, since time immemorial, the iron rule in the real world is you govern by strength, you govern by power, you govern by might. And basically the only limits on American power, on American influence is the limits of what they can get away with. They can do what they like with impunity.
So does he want Greenland because he has small hands?
I mean, he is now. I thought there was a softening by Marco Rubio to the extent that he's saying, "Look, we'll talk about this. We'd like to buy Greenland." But then Trump is saying, "No, militarily if necessary." And apparently there's a provision in Danish law: shoot first and ask questions later if there's any military presence.
So
in
what
Greenland.
does Ireland do in that situation? Ireland, we haven't condemned outright Trump and the American administration for Venezuela. There's been careful words, but there have been stronger words about standing up for Greenland and for Denmark.
We have to stand up for Greenland and Denmark. That's an EU territory.
Oh, but we're
If it's
militarily
invaded by-
neutral. Don't we just stand back and say, God, that's terrible. Look, can you not do something different? Can we not have peaceful talks? But we're not getting involved.
But we're EU members. It's very difficult. And he did say, Micheál Martin did say in China that we stand full square with Denmark, whatever that means.
Matt, I know, you rightly on the last word question for me for underestimating how far Donald Trump would push things. I still believe military intervention in Greenland is a negotiating point. I think that's where he's starting from. I think,
Larry, I have to tell you, you've been so naive about Donald Trump over the last couple of years. And I'm not being insulting you. I'm just saying, you were one of the people who said to me, the legal guardrails were there to prevent him behaving like an authoritarian dictator. And he has trampled all over those guardrails. And the worst excess is the things that we've said are impossible are the things that he's doing. He's even got his ICE agents out shooting his own citizens now.
Well, that's one thing that in terms of the president's authority over immigration, he has near plenary authority when it comes to immigration. So effectively, there were no guardrails on that. There never have been in terms of the use of executive power. But my own view is that what's likely to happen, I think Marco Rubio probably hit it right, is when we say buy Greenland, what I suspect the United States will put forward a deal, and indeed the Greenland opposition leader has said this, that there should be bilateral discussions between Greenland and the Trump administration, not involving Denmark. And what I suspect might be put forward is a proposal to give each citizen of Greenland a certain sum of money, as well as the right to live, work, and be educated in the United States, and to see if there is an audience, a receptive audience for that in Greenland, with the idea that it would have some sort of association or affiliation, not become part of the United States, but some sort of association. I suspect that might be where things are headed if he does go to the extreme. And you're right, I'm not going to rule it out. It could well happen because he's gone well beyond what I thought he would do in many other spheres. Then we're in absolute crisis territory at every level. It means the end of NATO. I know that President Trump will only be in office 3 more years, but I don't see how NATO comes back once one NATO country has effectively made something of a declaration of war or conflict on another NATO country. And we see a real quick unraveling in many respects of the world order. That's why I'm hopeful. I'm hoping against hope, and that probably colors what I think will happen. But I'm hoping we don't get there.
Yeah, and I think this is where we're actually never going to be in a position in the future of talking, will Ireland ever become a member of NATO? That's moot at this stage. But the problem is, do we actually have to become a member of an EU defence union, a new replacement for NATO, and as a member of the EU will be required to do so? But Brenda, I actually want to bring up as well, Ireland's relationship with America. And on the podcast last week with Shane Coleman and Lise Hand, we were talking about Steve Bannon. And he has been making comments about the MAGA movement for Ireland, that he has seen Ireland as the next staging post. And I think it's very easy to dismiss it. He's just a crank and the rest of it. And then if you do start thinking about it, there's an enormous amount of American interest in what happens here in Ireland. For example, the cables that run through our waters for financial transactions with the rest of the world, and they have right perhaps to be concerned about as to whether we're adequately safeguarding and defending them. There's also the enormous amount of tax revenues that we take from American companies, which they might think they should be actually paying back in the United States rather than paying in Ireland. So while I'm not positing that after Greenland, Ireland would be next, that they would want Ireland as a 52nd state, maybe by proxy, maybe these people think that they want a MAGA-friendly government in Ireland, if they're trying to find some sort of Trump-like figure. And I know that sounds like a ridiculous exaggeration, but what else is it that Bannon is up to? And trying to stir things up as well, saying Ireland is under threat at the moment and exaggerating the extent of the change brought around by immigration, for example.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you say, Larry, I mean, we have to walk a very fine line dealing with the United States and with China. So, I mean, we can't afford to be MAGA unfriendly, I guess. Whether the extent to which those kind of ambitions could ever be fulfilled here is, I'd say, hopefully I'm not as naive as Larry, but fanciful, I would say. But I mean, it does show, yes, as you say, this expanding of this kind of colonial or empirical ambition doesn't necessarily know any bounds. And that should concern us because, I mean, it seems that he is determined to move the world back to the early 20th century when it was all about might and all about power, which cost, as we know, millions of lives. So, I mean, there's nearly more than Trump himself to be concerned about here. You know, this is a very
He's representative of a
movement.
degree of thinking in America, isn't he? Which might survive Trump.
Exactly, which might survive Trump. And when you get the likes of Miller saying things like that, I mean, he's clearly not just Trump acting on his own. I think that's a perception we have here, that Trump is the demon. Trump is you know, if we could get rid of him or whenever his term ends.
J.D. Vance could be worse, given his connections with some of the tech bros and things like that. And indeed, and just before we take a break, Larry, it has been suggested that this guy, Stephen Miller, I mean, he did a wild television interview earlier in the week, and we carried some of it in our edition with Marion McKeown, but that he in many respects is the Prime Minister of the United States. That would be his position in any other country, that his relationship to Trump is that close and that influential.
Yeah, he's a deeply malevolent individual who has a certain worldview, which I think is appalling and would be rejected by the vast majority of the citizens of the world. But he has the president's ear. And I think that's really scary. And in that vein, I think this is where my biggest underestimation came. I was never under any doubt that the Trump administration wanted to redefine the United States. With Steve Miller and others in Trump's orbit, they want to redefine the world. And that is a very different thing.
We need to take a break. We'll be back with more with Brenda Power and Larry Donnelly after this. While headlines focus on short-term market movements, some investments are built for the long haul. Greenman Open is a European long-term investment fund that takes a decades-long view, investing in a portfolio of grocery-anchored real estate across Europe. It's an investment in the steady, recurring need for food, in the supermarkets and everyday need shops that perform consistently, even in challenging economic times. Open aims to offer investors a way to access this stability through a single regulated fund. Learn more at greenmanopen.com. A quick but important note: all investments carry risk. The value of your investment may go down as well as up, and you may get back less than you invest. Past performance is not a reliable guide to future performance. Welcome back to Path to Power. Now, Brenda Power, Larry Donnelly with me today. Brenda, we just mentioned the tech bros there before the break. And Elon Musk is back in the Trump orbit. He was down in Mar-a-Lago last weekend having dinner. All the stuff he was saying about Epstein and paedophiles is forgotten, it seems.
Epstein's forgotten completely since the events of the
Wag
last
the
few
dog,
years.
as
Amazing,
we
isn't it?
discussed with Marion the other day in relation to this. But Elon Musk's X, or Twitter as some of us still prefer to call it, has this AI function built in called Grok. And it is doing something appalling at present. It's basically allowing people the opportunity to undress people. And when I say people, it's nearly always women and girls, because that's the way people behave on social media, for nude photographs and whatever. And this is something that it seems the Irish government doesn't know how to deal with. The British government wants to crack down on it. Europe wants to crack down with it. There seems to be a reluctance to confront the tech bros about this, which is, and I wonder, is this because J.D. Vance goes around shouting and screaming about Europe is cracking down on free speech? I mean, the irony of it when you see that free speech in America runs the risk of being shot by your own administration now. But leaving that aside, how are we going to confront what is happening? Can we have, I mean, surely should we be shutting down X in Ireland and Europe?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, there is the facility, apparently, to remove this particular ability, this ability to undress people at the request of users. I mean, it's appalling, but we are hogtied by the fact that the headquarters of X is here in Ireland. But also,
so we're not. It actually gives us more opportunity to regulate it.
But equally, we're fearful of upsetting Trump, and it comes back to the fine line that we're all obliged to walk these days. But I mean, you know, the reality is that this facility, you know, is the objection to it, or the management of it, is being kicked around between the Department of Justice, the Department of Communications, the Data Protection Agency, and Comisiún na Meán. Nobody seems to know who is responsible for this. The Gardaí, in theory, also have the right to act because there's a 2017 sexual offences law that criminalises the production of child porn images. And what's happening here apparently is that people, users, are going to this particular facility and asking it to undress women and children. And now I saw today in today's papers a suggestion that there's going to be a beefing up of legislation to criminalise this kind of behaviour. And then you have Patrick O'Donovan's suggestion of a digital wallet and access to social media requiring identification and your PPS number or whatever. So it should make it easier.
But why don't they just say that this function has to be removed by the... I mean, like, it's in the way that newspapers are required to take responsibility for what they publish. If this social media site is making this function available, then quite clearly just move in and say, that's not allowed. Stop, you're not allowed to do that.
But the question is who says it?
Rather than Patrick O'Donovan putting it back on people as to their behaviour.
But the question is who says that? Who does that? Is it which department is it? The EU? Well, the Commissioner Mann seemed to think that it's an EU responsibility. But here's the irony of this, though, Matt. I mean, we know that for years the most appalling, vilest of hard porn has been available on social media. Yeah. And suddenly we're inflamed because these are fake people, fake images, real images of children, real images of women have been circulated for years. And you've seen time and again when people responsible for consuming these images come before the courts here, they get away with a slap on the wrist. So we haven't been taking this seriously enough, long enough. So to get our knickers in a twist because we're talking about imaginary people or artificial people.
Well, it's not necessarily artificial, it's real people.
No, they are real people who haven't consented. But I mean, at the same time, have children consented? Have any of the children in these porn images consented?
No, absolutely. But I think it's the ease of access on X, you know, that you can actually you load it on your phone, whereas it's perhaps people are more reluctant to access pornographic websites, and fewer people do so. It's just the availability of X on nearly everybody's phone. Yeah.
Well, my point would be this is not to excuse the failure to act, which I think there needs to be action. There needs to be concrete action in terms of legislation and whatever other forms can be done to minimize it, to eliminate this, basically. But you mentioned regulation of newspapers, Matt. The reality is it's a lot easier to regulate newspapers than it is to regulate social media platforms. The first thing that there will be are workarounds. For instance, they had the ban, the much heralded ban in Australia for under 16s on using social media. I'm told that the first thing that they did was find a million ways to work around that ban. And that's the issue is, and again, this is not excusing failure to act, is how do you go about stopping this? I just don't see a mechanism for doing so. And even if you were to say this is on the statute books, we will prosecute, et cetera, the first thing that will happen is some sort of workaround.
And you see, the thing is that the problem is, Larry, is that these platforms are seen as billboards rather than publishers. Yeah. And that goes back to a directive that they obtained in 1999, the Safe Harbor Directive, which basically says that social media platforms, that the tech giants are not publishers. But they are publishers, and if any traditional media published any of these images, they'd be prosecuted. So it's. I mean, somebody really needs to take charge.
And that brings back the old fight, which I know has gone on for many years among lawyers for social media companies in the United States versus lawyers for social media companies on this side of the Atlantic, who have very, very different understandings of the limits of free speech. And in the United States, that is an untrammeled right, whereas on this side of the Atlantic, there's a much different understanding to it. So All of this leads to a very complicated milieu and renders these things very, very hard to regulate or stamp out.
But you can't argue that the ability to take somebody's image and render them naked or in a pornographic setting is an exercise of free speech, because free speech has to be limited by other people's rights.
Something else that's really interesting, something that Jim O'Callaghan, the Justice Minister, slipped out just after Christmas, was the Garda Síochána Powers Bill. And this came out 2 days after Christmas. And there are proposals in it to grant Gardaí the powers to seize phones and laptops belonging to journalists. So they can't actually crack down on social media sites, but they can come after journalists for their phones and for their laptops. And this would be, it seems, Brenda, to access information that might help Gardaí in an investigation. And I think this is a really serious and sinister development. I don't see why this is being attempted by Jim O'Callaghan and the government. And I don't know if you remember back in our old Sunday Tribune days, we're going back into the last century now at this stage. Sorry, Brenda. And you wouldn't remember it in the way that I'd remember it, because I was really involved in this as the editor of the paper at the time. But we had an issue with Ed Maloney, who died last year. Ed, our northern editor, had conducted interviews in relation to the murder of Pat Finucane with a UDA informant called William Stobie. And the police in the north attempted to seize the interviews that he had and the notes. And we spent a lot of money fighting this in the courts in the north and defending Ed on the very strong principle that you would make it very dangerous for journalists if they took information, they got information in good faith, which then people, terrorists or criminals or whatever, felt would be handed over to the Gardaí or the police as part of their investigations. That you limit the ability of journalists to find out things to put into the public domain. You endanger them, and you essentially make them stenographers for the Gardaí or police doing their own investigations. And also, I mean, this is a real intrusion in relation to identification of sources. I thought it's bizarre. And when you think about it as well, actually, that I wonder about the evidential quality of any information that is actually found by journalists, because if you say, for example, the tribunals that we've had over the last couple of decades, whenever it came to prosecutions afterwards, the information from the tribunals heard was not regarded as admissible. And the Gardaí would have to conduct an investigation from scratch again into all of the things heard of the things. So what's your take on what's going on, Brenda?
Because obviously the trail of evidence has to be verifiable in any criminal prosecution. I mean, there was a Supreme Court decision on this in 2023 regarding, if you remember, those repossessions in Roscommon and the filming of them or some material that was available in relation to that. And the Supreme Court upheld the Court of Appeal decision that these could not be accessed at the time. But if you get a change in the law...
Because say if the likes of a broadcaster or no, the print media is doing videos all the time as well, but if journalists film something on ongoing issues such as the evictions down, repossessions down in Roscommon, and then if their material is seized, this has actually, I think, also been a point in relation to riots and things like that. And then it can be used by the Gardaí to try and secure prosecutions or convictions against individuals who are identified as rioting. But that then makes it for further riots dangerous for the broadcasters or for the photographers, the photojournalists, because the people will think, well, you're actually filming stuff that'll be given to the Gardaí, so essentially you're doing the Gardaí's work for them.
Yeah, no, you're right, it is dangerous. And I mean, I know he's suggesting, I think it is that absolute privilege will still be retained, which is solicitor and client or whatever, but that qualified privilege which journalists enjoy will be examined on a case-by-case basis. I mean,
by who?
Exactly. And I mean, it can see all of these ending up in the courts. But if there's a legislative change, the courts will have to implement that.
Yeah, I think this is deeply troubling for all the reasons that Brenda and yourself have outlined in terms of the work that journalists do, the vitally important work that journalists do, the importance of confidentiality of sources. And I think the fact that this proposed legislation is so dangerous is highlighted by the fact of the date of its release. I think that there's no accident.
Slip it out just after Christmas, 27th of December.
The date was no accident. I know the minister has said that there are safeguards in place to ensure against all these worst case scenarios that he might say that we're painting here. I think still it's a big, big mistake.
And we're still waiting for the revised defamation law that might actually eliminate the likes of the SLAP, the strategic litigation against public participation. So, the climate for journalists to do their work with ease is definitely diminishing here. Trump may be right about our access to free speech.
Okay, it's an interesting one. Something else that came up during the week was, Brenda, and this is a political issue as well, and I had Sean Canny on the Last Word on Thursday evening about this as well, Junior Minister in the Department of Transport. Road deaths went up enormously last year, went up significantly last year, 190 road deaths, including a significant number of pedestrians and cyclists in particular. And as Chief Superintendent Harrington in the Gardaí during the week, when questioned about it, did say that people should inform, even on family members and friends, if they know they're doing things like drunk driving or whatever. And a lot of our listeners said, well, you've got to extend that to things like speeding and use of mobile phones and various other things that people do, which are now making driving more dangerous, perhaps, for many people. But what was fascinating to me was that the amount of people getting in touch saying there's no point in informing. The Gardaí do nothing if you get in touch to say, my neighbour across the road arrived home drunk or he's after doing this. The Gardaí just don't seem to follow up on these things.
No, nothing's going to happen. Well, didn't that come out last year that there was a lack of enthusiasm in the Garda roads division about following up on prosecutions, and that was possibly because of leniency. But I mean, personally, I had a friend, and a neighbour who was killed, pedestrian, just before Christmas on the road. One of last year's statistics. A young man that I babysat, but I mean, I don't think there is a family or a community in this country that hasn't been touched by road deaths. I think that the idea of informing on your neighbours or on people to be breaking the laws is all well and good. As you say, it's probably not going to be effective. There is a taboo. I do think that there is a social disapproval for drunk driving. I do think that is the case. Speeding, not at all. Not at all. Speeding, using your mobile phone, not at all. And I mean, if you listen to the traffic reports every morning on the M50, which is an intractable congestion problem, but it is heightened every morning by collisions. And collisions, according to the traffic administrators on the M50, are almost inevitably caused by rear-ending. And that's somebody looking at their phone and not noticing that the car in front has slowed down. So the use of mobile phones and speed are the single biggest causes of accidents in this country. And I mean, I think that we talk about, enforcement, and this is the guards' fault, and that maybe there are accident black spots on the roads that are not being addressed. The reality is this is personal behaviour. This is people's own decisions. And I do think that, I don't know whether you agree with me or not, but that even the last few years, the aggression, the speed, the impatience, the anger of other motorists on the road has really become marked. And what we're talking about here is you have to be able to deter this kind of behaviour. It seems to me, this may sound like a mad suggestion, I think that the only way to really deter the bad behaviour you see on the road is if somebody loses their licence for in excess of 6 months, that they should have to resit their driving test because they're clearly not fit to have a licence. I can tell you that up there with the leaving cert, the driving test is the single most terrifying experience of my life. I think most people would agree with that. If you had the prospect of having to sit your theory test again, queue for a licence, go along and hope for the best with the tester, I think that would put manners on people. We do not take this seriously enough. We treat every road death as if this is a terrible tragedy, God help us, isn't it awful, instead of a structural failure. And the failure is to address individual behaviour. And we haven't cracked down enough on that. I mean, there was that report, Matt, before Christmas about the use of the poor box. I think I mentioned this before.
Yes.
The use of the poor box to allow people to circumvent their last 2 penalty points that might just put them off the road. That's outrageous. That shouldn't be happening. We are not strict enough. There are too many loopholes. There are too many exclusions. And I think we need to get much tougher on people who are caught speeding and drunk driving.
Yeah, I would concur with everything Brenda said. A couple of points I'd make. One is that, and God told me this, that a lot of instances where there's very high speeding and it results in a fatality or more than one fatality, the drugs are at play, in particular cocaine.
Yeah, apparently of the drink driving and drug driving, it's now 56% of those in a 5-week period who were done were for drink driving, 44% for drug driving, and that's a big increase, I suspect.
Yeah, and the God was making the point to me that the invincibility brought on by doing cocaine leads to people driving at extraordinary speeds, uncontrollable. I take Brenda's point about the societal disapproval of drunk driving, but I think you'd be surprised how many people are still at it. Maybe not,
in rural Ireland in particular, when they say we don't have public transport alternatives.
It would be, sure, I can have 5 or 6 pints and I'm grand. It'd be that kind of thing is still going on all over the country. There's no question about it. And the other couple of points that I think are worth making is, as with lots of things, we've welcomed prosperity. We've welcomed the growth in population. But at the same time, infrastructure hasn't necessarily improved to meet that. And what I mean is that, for instance, a lot of the roads that we still have, I mean, new road infrastructure is good, but a lot of the older roads, for instance, you can't fit 2 of these huge SUVs down the road at the same time because these roads were built at a time where people were driving likes of Ford Fiestas. So also in concert with that, the number of cars on the road has dramatically expanded. So all of these things contribute to what is a horrendous milieu. And at the end of the day, right, road safety is huge and needs to be continue to be pushed. Road infrastructure needs to be improved. But at the end of the day, the answer to this, I think, is to get more people out of their cars and into public transit, and by investing massively on an ongoing basis in public transportation.
Which is fine for urban areas, but doesn't necessarily work in rural areas. And I wonder as well, and I know in America, where you come from, the deaths per head of population from traffic accidents are a multiple of what they are in Ireland. I mean, you have an extraordinary situation over there. But do we have the political will really here to take on these issues? When you mentioned rural roads and speed limits, you try and bring those down immediately. County councillors are up in arms. You can't be doing that. You can't be reducing.
Sure, nobody pays attention to speed limits on the roads. I mean, that's the point. And there aren't enough Gardaí to police it. So nobody pays. You know yourself, Matt. If you're driving on a rural road and you're sticking to the speed limit, someone will be up your backside flashing you to get out of their way.
Enforcement's an interesting one. So there was actually became very interesting as well for me on the last word during the week where somebody texted in and said that it should be compulsory for all pedestrians to wear high-vis jackets. Right? And this led to a very interesting flurry of messages into the programme, some things that I actually hadn't thought of in relation to this. One very much saying, this is victim blaming, sort of to an extent. The responsibility lies with motorists. And it's a way that, that sort of some motorists now are disdainful of cyclists. But if they're not wearing a helmet, they deserve what's coming to them almost sort of thing. Cyclists shouldn't be on it. So it's almost now pedestrians you're waving. But then other people were pointing out, well, even if you don't blame the victims as pedestrians, maybe you do need to take on a bit more responsibility for yourself, because particularly the wider SUVs on country roads, all these roads that don't actually have footpaths and people have to push in alongside the hedge to make sure they're not hit by cars coming, that cars are not giving the 1.5 metres that they're supposed to give to cyclists or pedestrians. But the point that came up with a lot of people as well is you could mandate this, you could inflate, but who's ever going to enforce it?
But also, it's not compulsory to wear a high-vis jacket on your bike. It's not compulsory to wear a helmet.
Should it be?
I noticed that the deaths, possibly, that deaths of cyclists and particularly motorcyclists increased, by enormous levels last year. How exactly? How do you police it? At the same time, yes, what we call victim blaming often equates to, well, maybe take some more responsibility for your own situation. If you are walking home in the dark late at night along a country road with no footpath, then have a torch, have a high-vis jacket, absolutely. But at the same time, I think personal responsibility on behalf of the motorists too, Larry, as you say. Yes, SUVs are wider and the roads are not always wide enough to accommodate them. In those circumstances, then the drivers need to be extra careful. But nobody seems to take on board the fact that I'm not allowed to drive my giant car, way, way bigger and wider than anything I could possibly need, as fast as I like on any road I wish.
Yeah, I agree completely with what you say, Brenda. The enforcement issue is a key one. Will we ever have the number of Gardaí or the resources necessary to enforce these things? And as long as we don't, and we're dependent upon personal responsibility, there are people in all categories of road users who will not assume personal responsibility, and sadly, will have tragedies continue.
But if you make, say we'll say we can't afford the enforcement, or we haven't the resources to increase the enforcement, if you make the penalties harsh enough, and I really do think the prospect of resitting my driving test would make me drive at 20 miles an hour for the rest of my life. If you have the penalties that are harsh enough, then people will police themselves.
And one other topic I want to get to is something you were writing about in your column in the Irish Daily Mail on Tuesday, Brenda, was an interview that Mary Lou McDonald of Sinn Féin did with the Sunday Times. And I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from it to sort of set in context. The Sunday Times piece starts with Mary Lou McDonald has urged calm, cop on and common sense on transgender policy, warning against division as Sinn Féin prepares to revise its gender identity stance. The Sinn Féin leader criticised a limited but loud group in society that had sought to divide, to demonise and marginalise others, rhetoric which she said sparked a growing sense of fear within Ireland's LGBTQ plus community. She said her relationship with her transgender sibling had influenced her view on the issue. Quote, on the gender issue with my own sister, of course, we've had conversations. We don't have public policy discussions, but like anyone else, your lived experience matters. So you took issue with this, Brenda.
Yeah, I did, because what she suggested was that this is a matter that should be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. So what we're talking about here, Matt, is biological males having access to women's safe spaces, to places where women are vulnerable, changing rooms, refuges, prisons, and then, of course, playing women's sports, playing against women in women's sports. And what Mary Lou McDonald is suggesting is that basically, in some circumstances, I don't know who is going to determine this, but that males should be allowed into these spaces on a case-by-case basis. I do not agree with that, and I do not believe that the people she is talking about who are opposed to this, mainly women who are concerned for the hard-won rights and the hard-won liberties that we have achieved, that men should be kept out of female spaces. I don't believe that that is a limited or small minority. I think most people exercising basic common sense will say it is simply not acceptable that women should be denied same-sex, single-sex spaces because some men wish to encroach on them. And I do not believe that there's anybody resisting that is doing it out of a desire to demonise, to marginalise or to isolate, but simply out of a desire for women to have the sort of protections. 98% of sex crimes are committed by men against women. And I would question why we have these males who are so eager to access places where women and children are vulnerable. And I think women are entitled to question that. And I do not agree with Mary Lou McDonald saying we'll deal with this on a case-by-case basis, because that means there is no such thing as single-sex spaces for women. And I mean, there was a case 2 years ago in a women's refuge in Rathmines where a homeless woman was grievously assaulted by a trans-identified male in a woman's refuge, in a homeless woman's refuge. It turned out that this individual had multiple previous convictions, got a suspended sentence for that attack, but it turned out they were serving their sentence in the Docus Women's Centre. Now, this is not acceptable to most women, I would suggest, and I think Mary Lou McDonald is completely wrong to say that women should be obliged and that it is not calm and that it is not common sense and that it is not cop on to object to this. As a woman, I find that absolutely unacceptable, and I do not believe that any common sense approach would accept that males should be playing sports against women or should be in women's refuges.
Larry?
I take Brenda's points on board, and I suspect she probably speaks for what is a very solid majority of the Irish people. On the other hand, I do think that there is an infinitesimal, a very, very small minority of people who do fall into this category. And I speak from personal experience of a contemporary that I grew up with the person had both a boy's name and a girl's name. And I used to see the person at Mass, of all places. And my heart always went out to that person who was so isolated because of the condition. And I do think that there are people like that and that they need to be treated with compassion and respect. And that's it.
I agree. I know that they are, and I know some trans people myself. And the reality is that the trans women that I know would never in a million years have dreamt of marching into a ladies' toilet wearing a baby doll nightie and thigh-length boots, as I saw a chap doing in a pizza restaurant near me recently, and taking selfies in the ladies' bathroom. These people have gone about their business discreetly and quietly, and nobody was ever going to stop them. If anything, this trans hysteria has made life much more difficult for them.
You mentioned the issue of sport as well. And I sort of wonder as well if some people have actually weaponized that somewhat unfairly. I would, and we've had discussion off air previously about this, but the case last year or 2 years ago now, the Olympic Games, of the winner of a gold medal in the Olympics, Iman Khalif. And I thought that what I objected to in relation to that was the assumption been made by many people to deny her gender and her femininity, that they had decided that she was a man without any proof. There is no proof whatsoever that she is transgender, that she has changed sex. This is the Algerian fighter. There is actually no proof.
She or he is not transgender, but this person apparently has testicles. This is SDS, the sex difference. So this is
there's no proof of that.
A biological male.
Yeah, but there is actually no proof of that, and I think.
But if no one said she said this person was transgender, but that this, like Castor Semenya, who also has said my testicles don't make me a man. I think they probably do actually, and I mean I do think that we have to impose rules to protect women's safety. I mean the woman who was up against Iman Khalif said it was like being in a car accident, the beating.
Yeah, but lots of other women had lost fights to her, or beaten her in fights. Two Irish fighters had beaten Khalif previously.
Yeah, and two women who kill any man in normal combat.
But I've seen nothing to say that there is actually proof that she is a man. There's been a lot of internet theories and the rest of it, and that's my issue: is that these things get weaponized by people who are in the culture wars, who want to actually make issues out of something that based on their suspicions rather than actual proof.
Okay, well here's an actual statistic. As of last March, do you know how many women's titles, female sporting titles, were held by trans-identified males?
In Ireland?
Globally.
Who's counting?
The UN. This is a figure produced by the UN in March of last year. 900. These are 900 women's titles held by males. How many males' titles are held by women? That'd be none. None.
You see,
there's no clamour by women to play sports against men. In sporting terms, we're not talking about any invasive procedures. It's a simple mouth swab to establish chromosomal identity. That should be enough. I'd be very surprised if Khalif would pass that as a female.
You'd be very surprised, but you don't actually have proof.
Well, let's find out.
Well, she hasn't been stripped of her Olympic medal.
No, and that may be a problem. That may be an oversight.
Or maybe it's actually the right decision. Larry?
Look, by and large, I agree with the proposition that biological males should not be playing women's sports.
Well, so do I.
But
absolutely, I do actually believe that men should not be playing women's sports.
But again, I worry about this being weaponized into something or turned into something of an epidemic. This has happened in the United States when it comes especially to high school athletics. And when you drill down into the statistics on this in terms of how many biological males are playing women's sports, you're talking like a couple of dozen in a country of 350 million. So no, it shouldn't be the case. But again, it's being turned into this thing where it's happening everywhere. They're going to change the gender of your children. There's all these people out there trying to manipulate and change things. And I just don't believe that to be the case. And again, I'm not speaking as a social liberal. I'm a social conservative. But I'm just saying that I think that this is, a lot of it is scaremongering, and I just don't buy into it.
And I think it's a women's rights issue. And I think it's very notable that a lot of the people saying, oh, come on, let's live and let live. And if these trans women want to play female sports, let them, are men. And they're telling women basically got to bend the knee again to a man in a dress. We've done enough of that in this country.
Well, I certainly believe that there should be a third space if necessary when it comes to toilets and things like that. And I don't think, it has become common in a lot of restaurants around Dublin where men and women share the sort of space and they go to and I actually don't like that. I actually much prefer if men go to where men go, women go to where women. It makes everyone feel safer about the interactions.
The thing is that trans women will refuse to use those. I saw a quote, someone said there should be a special place in hell for women who deny trans women access to women's spaces. And someone had replied and said, yeah, and if there was, they'd demand entry to that too.
Look, I think that this is being made into a much bigger issue than it is. And in the process, again, my mind just drifts back to that person I knew growing up. And for that very small, vulnerable community, they are the ones who feel the most marginalized, the most vulnerable in the context in which people are talking about them and people aren't reflecting their lived experiences and all of that. Yeah. And I worry deeply about that.
Yeah, isn't it, in fairness to Mary Lou McDonald, I mean, she has personal experience from her family, so she is looking for calm and for cop on. That's a reasonable position to take,
It's a reasonable
isn't it?
position, but at the same time, you are talking about males wanting to access female spaces. And this is a basic, article of faith for most women that we are entitled to single sex spaces. And yes, absolute compassion and so on. But I mean, where a man wants to come into a woman's changing room or a woman's toilets or a woman's refuge or be housed in a woman's prison, you don't see anything like the same clamour, by the way, for women wanting to be admitted to Mountjoy or trans-identified women. That these are basic women's rights issues. Nobody is stopping trans people from using whatever pronouns they want, dressing as they want, going wherever they want, except you cannot access female spaces. And there have to be female-only spaces because of the harsh reality that the biggest threat to women's safety is males.
But I think we need
dress.
to clarify as well that just because somebody is trans doesn't mean that they're likely to be a sexual predator. The vast majority of people who are trans are not going to be sexual offenders.
They're males. They're males.
But then,
and males are the biggest threat to women's safety.
Well, then you're saying, you say all men are a threat?
My biggest concern in this debate, which I know is raging around the world, we've seen how poisonous culture wars in the United States have been. For instance, it's often said that the most powerful ad in 2024 was Donald Trump's radio ad that Kamala was for they, them, and Donald Trump was for you, in weaponizing this issue in such an extent to make people think that this is an epidemic or that the trans lobby is coming for your children. I think that's really disgraceful, and I'd hate to see that happen because we are talking about, again, a tiny, vulnerable community.
I don't know about that, Larry. I mean, when you see the push to issue puberty blockers and to children and to encourage, gender questioning in 4 and 5 year olds, I would wonder whether that is an attempt by a much older cohort to validate their own fetishes, maybe, by using children.
Well, I would share your concern in that regard, and I would disagree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Look, we leave it there. We're going to play, just before we finish, a clip from this week's subscription edition, which is the trade unionist and, well, I describe him as a left-wing firebrand, but he actually disputed that a little bit in this subscription edition. Let's hear a little bit of Brenda Ogle.
When an American president put out, the only one to do it, by the way, in 60 years, put out an olive branch in terms of Obama's release of some of the measures. The Cuban people that I met, and I was there when it happened, the Cuban people that I met that with generosity. And had that continued, we might not be in this situation today. So let's not go through the pretense. I know you're not, but I'm just going to say this very bluntly now. Let's not go through the pretense that the American administration gives a damn about the people of Cuba, or the people of Venezuela, or the people of Greenland, or the people anywhere. It's debatable whether the American administration gives a damn about their own people.
Well, I don't think they're even claiming that, even about their own people are present. But
it can be implied in these conversations that there's this noble country there trying to sort out all this commie red corruption there. And if the people in Cuba would just wake up and smell the stars and stripes, all would be great. America is a brutal imperialist regime which has crucified the people of Cuba any chance it got, and that's in the DNA of the Cuban people.
That's Brendan Ogle, no longer a firebrand, and just the context of that is we were talking about Venezuela's very close connections to Cuba, and indeed there were Cuban soldiers supposed to be protecting Maduro who didn't do a particularly good job. But Cuba's economy is already in a very, very bad position and made worse in recent months by the Venezuelan oil embargo, which means it hasn't been getting supplied massive power cuts. And even Trump himself said in recent days they wouldn't need to invade Cuba, that the economy is likely to implode there. So that's part of the conversation we had, because Brendan has been a regular visitor to Cuba over the years. And we had a wider discussion in the Pat to Power subscription edition, which is available wherever you get your podcasts if you want to subscribe. My thanks to Brenda Parr and Larry Donnelly for being with us here again today. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you to Aidan and Tom for the production. Until the next time, from me, Matt Cooper, thanks for joining us.